Hello, and welcome back to Organic Gardening for Beginners. My name is Jessica, and this is the show to help you get going in your garden, even if it is your first, second, third, or beyond, with a very minimal and stress-free style. Organic all the way. Sustainable, keep it going, low input, and have a good time out in the garden. It is the beginning of June, which, as always, means it's time for our What to Do in the Garden This Month episode. And this one is a little bit of a mix of planting stuff, getting things in the ground, as well as tackling a few little tasks or projects that are either going to apply right now or will set you up for success in the future, such as for your fall garden. So we're going to start off with make sure you're getting the last of your summer crops into the garden. If you've been dilly-dallying or busy or something died or whatever the case, this is the month to get those things in the ground. June is still a good month to plant crops like your squash, beans, cucumbers, some of your flowers. I'll go into those in a second. But if you are going to plant tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, I would definitely suggest that you find a seedling or plant start for those. It is too late to start from seed right now unless you are, I suppose, living in a very long growing season, or you plan to grow them under cover into the fall, because a lot of those nightshade summer crops like tomatoes and peppers need a very long growing season. So you should still be able to find seedlings out at all the nurseries, at some of your grocery stores or the farmer's market. You can even check your local Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. I've seen tons locally of tomato seedlings for sale, as well as peppers, eggplant, all that good stuff. So start keeping an eye out for that. Get those transplanted right away if you haven't yet. For your direct sowing, I already mentioned beans and cucumbers. Zucchinis and squash, those are all very fast growers, very fast germinators, so no need to buy those from seedling unless you need to skip that step for whatever reason. And those things will sprout in 5-ish days if you direct sow them in the garden, so you are not too behind on those. For myself, my own garden, I am also experimenting with starting a new crop of Napa cabbage and broccoli rabe specifically, because we eat a lot of those in my family, and all of my spring crops are mature right now and we are ripping through them. And I don't want to get through them all in a month or so and then have nothing left. So typically broccoli family crops like head broccoli or cauliflower, stuff like that, is more of a spring crop because it tends to not do so well in the heat of summer and with summer pests. But for this, I'm specifically growing broccoli rabe, which is not meant to make a head. Instead, it produces a lot of shoots and side stems with little mini florets on it so that it's less likely to bolt in the summertime. And for the Napa cabbage, who knows? I've never grown Napa cabbage in the dead of summer. It's always been a fall or a spring crop for me, but we love it. And so it's totally worth trialing it. And if it doesn't work or bolts or whatever, then I'll either toss it in the compost or I can feed it to my animals. If you haven't yet planted or want to do another round of, then you can still get a lot of root crops going, such as beets or carrots. Radishes are pretty much good to grow any time of year because they grow so quickly. For your carrots, depending on your watering system and your sun exposure, this can be a time where germination's a little bit tricky because your soil is going to dry out just a little bit faster if your garden is in full sun. So just keep an eye on moisture for those so that there's not a dried out crust on the top of your bed and those seeds can actually push through as they germinate. One trick that a lot of people use is to sow your row of carrot seeds and then put a board on top of them, something like a 2x6 or a 1x6, to keep it protected and cool until those seeds germinate. One thing that you do have to do, like religiously have to do, is go out and take off the slugs that are going to congregate under there, because just like the carrot seeds, they enjoy that damp, cool environment in the sunny weather, and they could likely eat your carrot seedlings as they pop up. Now, carrots are a strong flavored foliage, the leaves, so they might leave them alone, but that's not a gamble I want to take. If I'm waiting a couple weeks for these carrot seeds to germinate, The last thing I want is for a bunch of slugs or snails, depending on where you live, to come along and eat them. So keep that in mind. But your beet should come up just fine. Your radishes should do just fine even as it's warming up. For flowers, there are still a ton you can direct sow, and that means planting them straight in the garden, not transplanting them from seeds you started indoors or you bought as a start. And so we're looking at cosmos and sunflowers and zinnias, nasturtium. You can also plant nasturtium darn near any time of year. Calendula and marigold are two other very quick maturing, very easy to start from seed flowers that are good no matter where you plant them, when you plant them. They are just great beneficial attractors and pollinator attractors, and they're both edible. So you can always eat them. And the calendulas are medicinal for several things having to do with skin, like you can make a salve or a balm out of them. So I've got a ton of calendula right now so I can dry flower heads for fall gifting and projects and stuff like that. You can still transplant a lot of things as well if you are finding them out in the nurseries or the farmer's market. Snapdragons, black-eyed Susans, echinacea, statice, scabiosa. You might find a hollyhock that got started really early, or lupin that might bloom for you this year. Hollyhocks and lupins tend to be either biennials or perennials, meaning that they bloom their second year, and then in the case of a perennial, they come back from year to year, whereas a biennial typically only lives 2 years. But if you can find them as plants, chances are you'll get some flowers this summer. If you don't find those seedlings and you want to have those in your garden, this is actually a great time to start them either right out in the garden, or you can start them indoors and then plant them out later. And by indoors at this point, I wouldn't even bother with a light setup or, anything indoors. I would honestly just fill some 6-packs that you have left over or a little pot or yogurt container, and then just put it in a protected area outside, like your back porch or the overhang of your garage, something like that, where you can kind of keep an eye on it and make sure that it gets watered, but you don't need that artificial environment that you might have created in February when you were starting your tomatoes, because obviously your weather is very different right now. But to get back to the original point, the reason for starting your hollyhock, your foxgloves, black-eyed Susans, lupins, the reason you'd want to start them now is to give them the summertime to grow. Then they'll overwinter, and then they will bloom for you nice and early next season. So you would let them grow for a few months this summer, transplant them, I would say August, September, depending on how big the plant is, if you're growing them in pots. And that way they can overwinter, do their thing, and then bloom next year. This is what I'm doing for a lot of hollyhock and black-eyed Susan. I've already got some echinacea started, actually. So that way I can just kind of let them grow on the back burner and not have to start them super early next year and still get flowers next year. And I don't want to forget about my herbs because they always get kicked to the bottom of the list. For direct sowing herbs, cilantro and basil are still totally good to go, especially basil. It's going to produce for you all summer long. Cilantro, you'll probably get a good harvest off of it, and then it will bolt or go to seed because cilantro does not appreciate the summer heat. So if you plant your cilantro and after maybe a month, 2 months max, I would say, you start to see it sending up a tall stalk from the middle and forming white flowers, that means your plant has gone to seed, which isn't a terrible thing because those seeds are what we in the States call coriander. And you can eat them, you can cook with them. They are delicious in Indian style dishes or chutneys, or you can save them and plant them for next year. The flowers, before those seed pods develop, are very attractive to ladybugs in my experience. Butterflies and bees to a lesser extent, but man, the ladybugs just go nuts for them. I've seen that year after year. So I always let my cilantro go to seed once the warm weather kind of comes in. And I know I'm not going to get a whole lot of harvest off of that cilantro, even if I snip off that flower stalk. For other herbs, parsley, you could start now. It also needs a long, cool germination. So I would either try that board style that I mentioned with the carrots or start it inside or find a plant. Other herbs that are a little bit slower growing, at this point, I would probably try to find a seedling like thyme or rosemary, definitely something like lavender. Sage, you could start from seed. It's kind of like the parsley. Just know that it's going to take a while before it's big enough to harvest from, or find a seedling and toss that into your garden. Alrighty, and then away from planting, one tip I want to give you is this is the perfect time to start new garden beds. These garden beds aren't necessarily meant for you to plant in right now, but rather you are building for future garden space. So 2 ways that I like to do this. And one is, I actually just did this last weekend, I think it was, and that is a lasagna style garden bed where you put down cardboard and then a bunch of material that is totally dependent on what you have on hand. So for me, I laid down the cardboard. I use the litter from my chicken coop, so the straw, the chicken manure, dirt, whatever came up from the coop floor. And then I put in some kitchen scraps, like just, our kitchen carrot peels and potato peels and stuff like that. And then I covered all that with some raised bed mix that we used to fill our raised beds earlier this spring. And then on top of that, I put a layer of wood chips to stop it from just becoming a weed bed immediately. And I'm going to let that sit for a couple of months, especially since I have that fresh chicken manure in there. I'm not going to plant in it right away because that would be too hot. If I had aged chicken manure, then I would have put that bed together and then just planted in it right away. And the plants can grow while everything is decomposing, and the cardboard will break down so the roots can go right through into the native soil. And I find it to be a very easy way to create new garden space. If you don't have chicken litter or, what's it called? The aged compost from Craigslist or wherever, then you can do it with grass clippings, cardboard, leaves, if you happen to have any left over from last fall. And then as your last layer, put your soil, whether that's some garden soil from elsewhere or bags of potting mix, or, say you got a bulk delivery of raised bed mix and you got some left over. And then if you don't want to wood chip it right away or cover it with some other sort of mulch, a great way to help all that material break down quickly is to plant a cover crop. And cover cropping is its own science in a way, and I'm not a pro at it, but I do like to use buckwheat as a super, super low maintenance and easy to handle cover crop. So build your lasagna style bed, and instead of wood chipping it for mulch, sprinkle your buckwheat seeds over the top of it and let those sprout. It will grow, maybe 2 feet-ish tall, and it will produce a ton of white flowers that the bees love. And it is a frost sensitive crop. So once your fall frost comes around, it's going to die back and you can just leave it in place all winter long. The roots are going to decompose in the soil. The top greenery is going to decompose in the weather, and it won't all disappear or anything. But come springtime, all you have to do is pull those dead stalks and flowers to the side, pop in your transplant, and let it grow up and around that buckwheat mulch that is in place. I wouldn't recommend direct sowing unless it were something like, a zucchini plant or 2 little bean plants, but I wouldn't go and direct sow, a line of lettuce or radish or something like that, because they have to kind of fight their way through the leftover buckwheat greenery. But that's a great way to have your bed ready for planting next spring while doing very, very little work. You basically just have to put it together, sow it, keep it watered, and then really just walk away. Let nature help you out on that. And then next one up is make sure your trellises and your drip irrigation are in place now if that's what you're going to use this season. So I mentioned this, I think, a couple of episodes ago. If you plant something and you tell yourself, I'm going to come back tomorrow or next week or whatever to put in the trellis, if you're anything like 99% of us, you're going to forget or say, yeah, next week, yeah, next week, yeah, next week. And next thing you know, you have this big tangled mess of cucumber vines or sweet pea vines or snap peas or whatever it is, and you can't really get the trellis in there anymore. So if you've got your stuff in the ground, get your trellises or your stakes or your tomato cages, whatever they are, up around those plants before they get too big. If they have tendrils, they're going to start grabbing onto themselves and squishing their leaves, and it just becomes a bigger pain in the butt than it's worth, as opposed to just getting it done now. And this is the same for drip irrigation. Weaving around plants is a pain enough. I love drip irrigation. I hate figuring out all the angles and the corners and, is this plant covered? And so when you are digging around scratchy zucchini plants or your lettuces that have gotten really big, it's just even more time consuming to do it as opposed to when they are small plants and you can clearly see where your garden bed is and where you're going. So get those done now. Don't dilly-dally. It just makes more work later. And then, as always, I would be remiss if I didn't make sure you've got everything mulched. Even if you're in containers or pots or hanging baskets, everything can benefit from a layer of mulch. I, as always, love to put down my wood chips because they hold in so much moisture and they block weeds so effectively, and I can get them for free from my local arborists. But use whatever you've got. As I mentioned before, grass clippings is a great backyard source for mulch. Do it before your grass goes to seed. Otherwise, you will potentially be just be planting grass seed in your containers. And that will take care of weeds, water retention. It'll help regulate. There we go. Regulate the soil temperature of your containers, especially if they're smaller. And it helps build organic matter over the season. Alrighty, so keep in mind that June is kind of the lull of the season before your harvests start to really kick in July and especially August. If you are going to be doing canning or anything like that, you know how busy those months can get. So this is a good month to do any of those tidy up chores that have kind of been sitting around and, you keep saying you'll get to them. Or maybe you're spending less time in the garden to focus on other things to kind of prep for those busier months when you constantly have fresh tomatoes and you constantly have zucchinis and the weeds that didn't get mulched or escaped you or whatever are getting big and need to be dealt with. So take June as kind of your get it done month. That's what I find best. Oh yes. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is last year I moved in June, which if you've been with me since the beginning, you know this. But the reason I bring it up is if you are moving this month, or maybe you just moved into your new house, apartment, whatever, don't feel like your chances of a garden are totally shot for this summer because there's still plenty of time. As I mentioned in this whole episode, there's lots you can direct sow. There's lots you can transplant. And even if you literally picked up your keys today and you can't get to your garden for a couple more weeks, that's okay. There's still plenty you can do, especially if you take advantage of finding seedlings that should still be available. Maybe you get them now and you just kind of baby them along until you can get them in the ground, or you wait and look for them in a couple weeks. But all of those warm season crops, find seedlings for those. You can direct sow. As I, again, already mentioned, zucchini, cucumbers, basil, even kale. Kale does really well in the summer heat. Heat-tolerant spinach or lettuce, nasturtium, marigold. You can find seedlings for chives and oregano, those tomatoes, those peppers. So get it in the ground as soon as you can, but don't feel like just because it's June, you have missed your opportunity to be able to get a garden going. I did it last season, a very quick summer garden, and then I shifted my focus to my fall garden, and it worked out, even, moving during a less than ideal time. So, all right, guys, get out there, have fun. Talk to you later. Bye.